Hello and welcome to this episode of the Game Dev London podcast. Currently coming live from Chesham, so that's new. And with me today, I have my wonderful guest co-host, Chris. Hey, Chris, how's it going?
It's good, thanks.
Good. So I'm Stuart Deville. You might have known that. I'm just assuming everyone knows who I am at this point. And today we're going to talk about player experience. Let's start with Chris. What is player experience to you?
Well, for me, it's basically it's the whole thing really, because when you're making a game, it's not the game does not happen on the screen or in the speakers. The game happens inside the player's head. So
Yep.
the graphics, the audio, the game design, all of these things like any writing in the game, all of the different elements um, come together to create this feeling for the player of in being in a space and playing that game, whether it is like an immersive RPG or whether it's like a survival horror that's also immersive, or whether it's like a top-down shooter, which is a bit more of an abstract space, but the player is still, totally focused on the rules of that particular game board. So um, and I think it's quite useful to consider the player experience in the context of other um, games as well as just video games, because for example, board games, uh, there's no sound effects on board games.
Yep.
There's not much in the way of graphics. You just have some still images and some little, if you're lucky, you have some like nicely sculpted counters.
Yeah.
But that's the board. A board game is all about conjuring this sort of feeling of being a master strategist or whatever the game is about. And so it's the game that happens inside the player's head.
Yeah. that's that's exactly it, isn't it? So the player experience dic- dictates how our creation or our game is received by the user/player. So for me, I've kind of broken this down largely, and I think it's fairly well known. I'm not entirely sure where I got it from originally, but I think it's fairly well known that we tend to break these things down into like six separate parts, which is player motivation, well, giving player motivation, having meaningful choices, uh, balance, usability, aesthetics and atmosphere or audio, and fun. Fun, obviously, being the hardest thing to measure. Um, what are your thoughts on motivation?
Motivation is an interesting one, because it's the classic would be an engaging storyline,
Yeah.
which is not strictly necessary because, for example, something I've been playing a lot of lately is Vampire Survivors, which is basically a kind of a bullet hell shooter where like all the bullets are yours, um,
Right.
and it's a sort of top down shooter. It's got a theme. It's got a vaguely sort of like horror fantasy theme to it, but there's no story. There's no plot. There's a bunch of characters who have very punny names that you can unlock. But it's all about the that particular game is all about the game design, and the motivation is to um, that particular one is all about like um, mastering the different tools and weapons that are available to you, and unlocking everything that gives you like an edge against all of these hordes of monsters. So um, I guess the it depends on the type of player, because you have classically, I can't remember how many there are, but I can probably off the top of my head remember like four classifications of there are players who are interested in immersion and story, players who are interested in
Yeah.
challenge, players who are interested in social interactions, and players who are completists. I think there's
Yeah.
probably another one or two floating about there. But those are different motivations. And somebody playing an RPG might be interested in story immersion, but also in completion because you want to see everything that's available in the world.
Yeah.
Um, Probably less interested in challenge. That's much more. That's the sort of motivation that would draw a player to an online multiplayer game where they're pitting themselves against other players.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of different motivations.
Yeah, it's true, isn't it? There's it's such a massive spectrum when you go from like a what what, what everyone on the internet calls like a hardcore gamer, right through to like a chill gamer. So someone who, like you say, is looking for like a real challenge, looking for lots of things to go on to explore. And then there are people who are like, actually, I just want a nice place to wander around in, maybe have a chat to some NPCs or other people online, um, and and then there's everything in between. And I think for us as the designers, the hardest thing is making sure we get those motivations correct, and making trying to find ways of having those be compelling, because there's a tendency to just be like, well, when you take what motivation is as a simple term, if you were to just be like, well, players want to kill lots of things, so I'm going to give them lots of things to kill, you can't really just do it under that raw a basis,
Yeah.
because there's nothing there.
It's a tricky one actually because if the game that I'm working on currently, we have deliberately elected. It's a fairly sort of like chill, um, low stress kind of game. We have deliberately chosen to ignore certain player motivations, such as challenge. We're not. There is nothing in the game that is in any way a test of skill or a difficult, something that is difficult to overcome,
Yeah.
in the same way that like Dark Souls is, or even like more mainstream um, games like Call of Duty or something, where like when you die, you just get set back to a checkpoint and you have another go. Um, we're not even doing that. There's no threat. So and that's something that came out of the Lego games where we were worried with the first of the Lego games, Lego Star Wars, that if you died and you were immediately just sort of like respawned more or less on the spot, it would feel pointless and like you wouldn't feel like death was any sort of setback at all. So why would you be concerned about it? And it turned out that sort of like just like the just the visual and audio feedback of like losing all of your studs, um, and that brief pause while you respawned was absolutely enough to make people not want to die because it there's it's very gentle setback, but it's just enough, and particularly for the target audience being families, you don't want to frustrate children. So,
Yes.
which is why you will not see. I mean, apart from the whole sort of like the dark storylines, you will not find a lot of kids playing Dark Souls, um,
Yeah.
because it's just too frustrating. It requires a particular mindset to just keep hammering away at that game. So, whereas in contrast, you see with a lot of AAA games like such as the Assassin's Creed series, they're trying to make that IP appeal to as big an audience as possible because they're spending a lot on it. So they want they want as many people as possible to buy it, and therefore, um, those games like now have multiplayer modes because that's what the players who want a challenge really want. They want to
Yeah.
be able to pit themselves and their skills against other players. So they there sometimes it leads to adding stuff into games that doesn't necessarily sit well with it. Even the Tomb Raider reboots had multiplayer modes bolted on, completely separate thing really, and um, not something that was really fitted with the single player game modes, but it was in there to uh, appeal to those players who love challenge and also to stop people from sort of like finishing the game and then taking the disc to like sell it on because publishers hate pre-owned
Yeah.
games.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah.
um, but yeah, that's so that trying to appeal to everybody, I think, is not necessarily, especially as an indie, you're better off picking one particular motivation that um, a group of players have, and go for that niche rather than trying to be all things to all people.
Yeah, I think it happens quite a lot in like big studio games, right? Because they're looking to well, they've got a bigger budget, not a bigger budget, and b bigger overhead.
Yeah.
So obviously trying to hit mass market and try and please everyone it always tends to be clunky along the fringes somewhere, doesn't it? It's never like, oh, they've perfectly nailed that and everyone loves it. It's always like, well, you tried to please everyone, and in doing so, you didn't really please anyone.
That's always the way. If you even with a big studio, you kind of, if you split your focus too much, then it's as if every component of the game was made by a slightly smaller studio. Um,
Hmm.
I think it's, but you get really sort of like, you get the pinnacle of stuff of games is when the everything is focused on the one experience. So like God of War doesn't have a multiplayer mode, does it? Um, Pretty
Yeah,
sure it doesn't. Um, but that's a good example of like all of the effort there was making that one single player experience work on one platform. Um, so there wasn't even any sort of like issues with like trying to port it or optimize it. It was built specifically for PlayStation, and uh, as a result, it's an incredibly slick and polished game because all of the focus was on that particular experience they were trying to create.
yeah, yeah. I think it's almost easier for like smaller studios
Mm.
because we're restricted in like what we can actually achieve. So it's almost like by nature of what we are, that we can't just be like, oh, we'll throw in this and that'll please those people, and we'll throw in this and that'll please those people. We're like, actually, let's please this small niche of people, because
Well,
that's currently what we can build.
that's absolutely right, and part of the reason for that is that an indie studio, if you're working on a low budget, then like you only need to sell into a small niche to cover your costs.
Yeah,
Whereas your Assassin's Creeds and um, like big budget games like that, they have to capture a substantial percentage of the entire market to make their money back,
yeah,
which is why even though the Tomb Raider reboots um, were very well received, they seemed to sell okay, but they were considered slightly underperforming. At least the first one, I remember people were surprised that IDOS considered it to be underperforming because they were looking to capture a big chunk of the entire gaming audience with that well-known IP, and
right.
so they were, and because they spent an awful lot on making it, because I'm trying to remember what the figures were. I think the figures were something like 5 million sales for the first Tomb Raider reboot, which
Wow.
sounds pretty respectable.
Yeah.
But I don't know how much they spent on making it. So if you run the numbers, sort of like it may have only barely broken even,
Hmm.
or possibly even made a loss. I don't know. Obviously, I mean, it must have broken even because I think if it made a loss, they probably wouldn't have gone on to make all the sequels. But
And there would have been a fair amount of news about it. I would have, I would have imagined.
yeah, probably.
Yeah.
I don't know. They don't often sort of studios often make a lot, bigger studios at least often make a
Hmm.
loss on games and don't make a big song and dance about it because it's not great business to say sort of like, yeah, we made this game and didn't actually make a profit from it.
Right. Right.
um
Yeah.
that doesn't fill your business partners and customers with confidence that you know what you're doing. so
Yeah.
so which is why businesses are fairly cagey about their finances as well, because that you don't want people to be looking at your finances and going sort of like, they can only, if this game doesn't sort of like doesn't make a profit, they're going to be out of money in 6 months.
Yeah, and then they do things like lay off 300 people, and everyone goes, "What? Why did they do that?"
Exactly. Yeah. Well, this is why people.
Yeah,
Yeah, it is. You sometimes get that sort of weird thing where sort of like they've just released a game that looks to be really successful. It's had great reviews, and yet they're laying people off. And it's like it's because probably it the game didn't meet the targets that they had set for it, and
yeah,
that happens obviously more with AAA studios, and than it does
mm,
with indies.
yeah,
But um, I guess with indies, it tends to be more either the studio sort of like either sort of like survives or collapses, rather than
yeah,
they lay off a load of people, because with an indie studio, there's not very many people to lay off.
yeah, yeah.
So
It's one of those things, isn't it? Like as an indie studio, you literally live and die by the success of your games. So
your last game as well,
yeah, yeah, yeah. Not
even
even
if
your
even if
game's
the one
over.
before it was good, yeah,
That money soon disappears.
it really does, yeah. So
Yeah.
it's the last one that is always critical. However, we have drifted a little bit away from player
Yes.
experience and into the developer experience.
So let's bring this back on track with meaningful choices.
Mm,
Um, meaningful choices is well, it kind of ties into like that. That's the same thing that we have with motivation, really. Like um, with the fact that when you provide a player with choices, those choices need to make sense. They need to feel good, and they need because obviously you can have like a storyline, and you want to take your player along that storyline, but you want to give them choices along that storyline so they feel like they have some
mhm.
agency and some control. But if every single decision that they make doesn't really matter because they're going to end up on the same linear path, then very quickly you're going to upset your audience.
Yeah, I
What are
mean,
your feelings on it?
well, this is a classic smoke and mirrors thing, because you want the player to
Yes.
feel like they are making meaningful choices. However, as a developer, ideally you want to implement as few choices as possible, because every choice is a ton of work
Hmm.
that is only going to be seen by a subset of the players. So if you not that many people will replay a game, especially if it's something sort of like big and sprawling narratively like Mass
Yeah.
Effect. So uh, if you have a branch point where you have two options, then people are going to choose those options. Probably only sort of like half of your players are going to see each option,
Mm.
and but it's just as much work to make each half. And if you have like a three-way choice or a four-way choice, or if each of those two branches splits, you end up with uh, combinatorial explosion and like far too many variations to cope with, which is why variations and the choices tend to be splitting within the dialogue, and then like
Yeah.
the resulting outcome, because that's all part of the same scene. So it's literally it's just a line of text and a line from an actor is the only difference between that choice and that choice, and setting a flag that we can reference later on. But the
Yeah.
trick is trying to make it, and there's a whole bunch of writing tricks to try to sort of make the player feel like their choices are being acknowledged by the game,
Yeah.
even if it doesn't take you to completely different planets and introduce different characters, because you don't
Yeah.
want to change the roster of characters that much from player choices.
Yeah. Not if you can
Otherwise,
help it.
exactly, yeah. So ideally, you want the game to be fairly linear, but feel like the player's making lots of choices. And Mass Effect is a great example of this. There's lots of tricks that they use there. So within a chapter, you go to a planet, you've got to try to like save the Krogans or something, and you will have a bunch of like splitting options within that storyline to do with like who you're going to side with and trying to persuade characters to do one thing or another. Ultimately, it all dovetails back together, and like either you succeed or fail with that chapter, and then
Yeah.
you move on, and you will have set. The game remembers that you did or did not save the Krogans, and also probably flags that sort of like you killed or did not kill this NPC, and you
Yeah.
did or did not do this subplot, and so on and so forth. So those things can be referenced later on with a little line of dialogue, because that's all it takes. It's
Yeah.
just later on when you go back and talk to the same character and they remember that you helped them or didn't help them. That makes it feel real.
Yeah, my favorite ones are the ones where you do something and um, a character um, behaves different towards you based on what you have done throughout the game.
Yeah,
Because that is kind of really like an easy win. You just go, yep, you did or didn't save that person, and because you didn't, maybe someone that you didn't save, you meet a character later on, and because you didn't go save those people, you actually inadvertently allowed their sibling to die or their parents to die or something,
yeah,
and so they're and in some cases that's done really well because that the character that you are interacting with kind of still has like it's a real world thing, like they still have to deal with you and kind of
yeah,
like maybe be professional with you or whatever, but you can feel the tension because they
yeah.
mention the fact that like you're the reason my family died and you're like, oh damn.
And that's a great example of that. That is pure flavor, because that does not
Mm,
necessarily change the um, the functionality of that character in terms of the story. They will still sell you weapons, or they will
yeah,
still give you information on such and such another character, but they will just do it grudgingly and
yeah,
grumpily rather than in a friendly manner. Um,
or they'll
so
give you worse gear when they would have given
you
you better
can, yeah. I
gear.
mean, or they will
That's
charge you a
quite a
higher
nice little,
price, charge
yeah.
you higher prices for
There's nice
equipment.
little
So
touches like that that
yeah, you
don't
can,
make these massive changes in the game that are going to cause
yeah,
the developers
exactly.
to cry.
Reflecting consequences in small ways is a
Yeah.
great um, is a great way to do it. But yeah, I mean, there are dozens and dozens of different tricks like that, from just like flavor and stuff. Key thing with making choices though is that you need to know that you're making a choice
Mm,
for it to be meaningful. So,
yeah.
for example, there's some stuff in Beyond Two Souls where there are like entire sort of like chapters later on in the game that are sort of like quietly unlocked by doing certain interactions in the early stages of the game. So if you look at a family photo at the beginning of the game, then that unlocks some stuff later on that leads to a whole new scene. But the thing is,
Right.
if you don't know that that stuff has become unlocked, then when you get to it, you don't feel that there's any payoff there, because you didn't know
Mm,
that it was an option. Which is why you get
yeah.
things like in The Walking Dead. Celestine will remember that, um,
Right. Right.
and like really sort of like telegraphing to the player that a choice that they made will have a payoff down the line. Now, I suspect some of those choices don't actually have a payoff down the line, but it just telling the player that it will gives this sense that the game is juggling lots of choices and it feels
Yeah.
meaningful. So the game is literally telling the player sort of like that made a difference, um, even if it didn't, because it's smoke and mirrors. And if in the player's head they're imagining this elaborate sort of complex plot simulation going on under the bonnet, when in fact it might well be a lot more linear than they think.
Yeah.
Um, but that's the cardinal sin, isn't it? This is why like games like Call of Duty are often sort of like called in a derogatory sense corridor shooters, because
Yeah. Yeah.
there's not they present a linear experience that is extremely polished at the cost of any sense that you're choosing to do anything. You're just being told what to do and you have to
Yeah.
go and do it. Um,
Yeah.
so
Go enter this space, shoot the guys that are going to come at you, clear that space, move on to the next space where some guys are going to come shooting at
yeah,
you. Yeah.
and that's fair enough, because like the
Yeah.
focus of those games is on the cinematic experience and the gunplay. So it's
Yeah.
all about the the feel of different weapons and your tactical choices about whether you are, who are you going to do, pick off first? Are you going to try to pick off the sniper up top, or are you going to just try to sort of like keep moving to avoid getting sniped whilst you clear out all the grunts who are easier to kill?
Yeah.
There are choices at a different level there that are not storyline choices. So in a game that is all about shooting, then your choice of who to shoot at can be extremely meaningful, even if the plot is
Yeah.
completely linear.
Yeah, it's short, immediate impact as opposed to long, changing, winding. Um, what would the term be? Yeah, so like I say, it's the difference between short term impact and long term impact. Um, you choosing who to kill means that right there you get feedback on that.
Yeah,
Whereas they don't need for you to kill the sniper on the roof and then find out later that because you killed the sniper on the roof, um, this other guy who was his brother is now going to be coming at you. That doesn't happen.
I would. I would also know that, I mean, we're talking about a lot about storyline, but in something like
Mm,
a racing game or a platformer, um, meaningful choices, I guess, it covers the player's ability to master the available gameplay verbs and use the right one in the right situation. So
yeah,
if you have a pit of spikes, you have to jump across it. If you have like a if you have like a vertical column with like alternating spikes on the left and right walls, then the sort of, oh, you've got to wall
right, yeah,
jump left and right to get up there. So um, and in some cases it's not that obvious which
mm,
tools you're supposed to use. You've got to get across all these like spikes, but should you be double jumping? Should you sort of like try to get up higher and glide? What are the
yeah,
options available to you? Is there something you can use a grappling hook to swing across it? you know the and in some cases you can't get across. In a Metroidvania, you might not be able to get across at all if you don't have the grappling hook. So
right,
it's about understanding the verbs that are available to you and like which ones you are going to use, and whether you should, whether you can use them or not, and you need to go and like look elsewhere for additional tools that will get you further in the game. So all of those things, and I guess in strategy games, it's about like understanding that when you change your city to produce these like different units, then that changes the balance of the battles, because now you've got like these units instead of those units. Um, it's all got to feel like um, your interaction changed things. So
yeah,
in some cases, I think even like in a strategy game, sometimes like there are units that are very similar to each other mechanically, but they maybe have like um a different look to them, or a different presentation or something, and that there may be something quite um I mean, realistically, in a strategy game, most players are interested in the mechanics of how that works, so that they do want all of their units to have slightly different functionality. Um, but I think maybe more in a mobile game, you'll find that there are sort of like um, mobile games where you have some choices that are available to you that are not distinctly different mechanically, but they just provide a different look. That so the difference between like a flamethrower and a machine gun might actually not be that much. Um, you know, there's potential for there to be lots of differences. So a flamethrower might set enemies on fire and then they like take damage continuously over time, whereas a machine gun doesn't. Or a flamethrower is a bit slower to cross the distance. So you can put a lot of different things in there,
yeah,
but it could be identical mechanics and just a different, just reskinned to look different. And in some cases, that can prove to be um, quite satisfying if you feel that like a flamethrower is an upgrade from a machine gun.
yeah.
So it
I
doesn't
think,
necessarily have to be a real difference.
yeah, I think that this actually brings us nicely along into balance.
Mm,
Um, because yeah, having the right thing, doing it the right way, and um, which all again ties in. I think between balance and meaningful choices, there's a lot of tie-in between the two, um, because yeah, you can go too far one way with one thing, you can go too far the other way with another thing, um, and I think well, there's lots of ways of looking at balance as well, isn't there? Because there's a way of looking at the highs and the lows that you bring to the player. What are your thoughts on balance? How do you deal with balance in your games?
Balance is a tricky one. I mean, honestly, I don't actually have all that much experience with balance because most of the games that I've worked on have been like the Lego games,
Right.
which didn't really have any need for balance because they didn't have try to satisfy that challenge motivation. So, you know, when you can just like die and respawn and keep on plugging away, um,
Mm,
it doesn't really. I guess in the context of the Lego games, there were a few bosses that maybe had like when we started putting health bars on bosses rather than just sort of like your classic Zelda 3 hit um, patterns. Um, there's an element of even if there's no real threat there, you just have to keep plugging away at the boss until you win. There's an
right.
element of how much health do you want them to have, and how long do you want the player to be fighting the boss, because it needs to be enough that they feel like there was a challenge and it was a hard thing to beat, but not so
Mm,
much that they start to get bored and frustrated that they're still trying to kill the same baddie. So even completely absent of any genuine gameplay balance, the in terms of the player experience, that like that health bar um, needs a little bit of tuning. Um,
yeah.
and then obviously you've got your classic sort of like damage per second, which is the only meaningful way to compare different weapons because uh, you can have like you can have a machine gun that shoots a lot of bullets that do small amount of damage very frequently, or you can have a shotgun that does a large amount of damage infrequently. Um,
Yeah.
and then there's other variables as well, like the amount of spread, the amount of splash damage, the potentially sort of like continuous damage because you set people on fire. There's a lot of ways that this is why combat is so good for video games, because there
Yeah.
are many ways to um, uh, get like hit points, armor, damage, and projectiles and zones to interact with each other. And we see loads of interesting explorations of that, especially in stuff like Overwatch, where you have that's a classic of balance where you've got lots of characters with different skills that are supposed to be contrasting and provide different ways to play, but they all have to be kind of balanced so that none of them are particularly um, overpowered.
Yeah. Yeah. I always find like whenever I'm making game. So well, the one that we're working on at the moment, I can't talk too much about, but like um, it's a tabletop game, and because it's sort of like one player versus another player, and you have certain elements in this game that help you win. We've even got a mechanic where, like, if you are winning too much, then you actually lose. So there's like a lot of
Yeah,
fun things that you can do with balance, especially when you've got multiple people playing, and you don't ever want to have it so that someone feels like there's something that they're given or there's something that some way to play it that gives them an unfair advantage. I mean,
yeah,
even when you're doing it like when it's just a player playing against the computer, as it were, um, that you don't want the player to ever feel like, oh well, once I get this, it's like, I can just walk through the game and complete it. There always needs to be a bit of a like. Again, it kind of ties into that meaningful choices. It has to feel meaningful. Like you don't. If anything's ever overpowered, then yeah, you're not giving them a game. You're just giving them something to walk through.
yeah. I mean, that's to a certain extent that can still be really fun. I mean, I like to play the Uncharted games on easy mode um,
Mm,
because I'm interested more in the like story and the exploration than the actual shooting. Um, and so for me, the shooting parts of Uncharted are reduced to sort of like picking a target pretty much, and it auto aims, and then I
Yeah.
pick them off. It still feels satisfying because I'm making decisions, I'm making meaningful choices about
Yeah.
who I'm going to target. Am I going to target the guys that are trying to flank me first, or go for the sniper with, or the guy on the tower with the rocket launcher who can only fire every few seconds, and I can hear him, so it's quite easy to just move away when he fires. But uh, those are still, they're still working out as choices. So the interesting thing with balance, I think, is that it's not just about making every weapon more or less similar in the, you know, so none of them are unfairly overpowered, and none of the different choices available to the players give one player an unfair advantage. But it's not always about fairness. It can be about pacing and, uh, as you say, sort of like trying to. I like the idea of a that board game you're talking about, where yeah, if you, it's not just about sort of like racing ahead, um, and because a lot of games tend to get into the trap of, once you start winning, that you're going to continue winning, um,
Mm.
because once you have sort of like wealth and resources and options, then you have a lot of different ways that you can apply it. But yeah, if you have to sort of like, if you have some sort of like mechanic that acts as a handbrake on that, like the rubber banding in Mario Kart,
Yeah.
then that's quite nice, because it means that you've got to be careful, or like if you get too successful, then that creates more things for you to worry about that a less successful player doesn't have to worry about. Um,
It's one of the things that I remember about the early days of Command and Conquer.
mm,
Like if you hunkered down and got your resources sorted, then kind of fairly quickly you became OP. You were just like,
yeah,
I've got all the resources, I can build whatever I want very quickly. And in some cases, you I became like a really kind of sadistic player, because I would hunker down, make sure my base is protected. I'm killing it on the resources, and then I will just send out something that will like take out the leg of the opponent for a little bit longer, so I can get more resources. So that by the time I head on over there, I literally just I've got such a big like army to slap them with that
yeah,
it's insane. Um, they obviously they got a lot better at balance as as the uh, as the games continued.
yeah,
So let's move on to usability. I think the thing about all of these things is like they do all tie in together. There's quite a lot of overlap, and usability is actually kind of almost harder to pinpoint,
mm,
because it's really just a case of like, can the player play the game?
yeah,
Like, is there sufficient UI feedback? Is there sufficient, like, even
yeah,
haptics, like feedback, like all of these things that allow the player to know what's going on and to interact with the game.
yeah. So, I mean, I would actually roll into usability, accessibility,
Mm,
as well, because
yeah,
usability by default, as you described, is all about. I mean, the biggest challenge is tutorializing the game, teaching the player how to play this game. What are the verbs that are available to you? What does the game expect you to do with those verbs? Um, so, you know, I remember that this is a fun little anecdote. The first time I played Thief was actually at E3 in '97, and it was on show there. This was an early build of Thief where you had a crossbow instead of a bow.
right,
Um, uh, and because I was used to playing Quake, I was trying to play it like Quake because it was a first person game and I had a weapon in my hand. So
yeah.
I tried to play it like Quake, and Warren Spector was stood next to me trying to explain what the game was about, and I was just kind of like, I know how to play first-person shooters, and I was like circle strafing around these guards that I had just walked into the room in front of, and trying to shoot them. I did not do very well in that demo, and I wandered off. And it wasn't until after the show couple of months later, the demo came out, and I played
Mm.
the demo, and that properly tutorialized it, and I paid more attention to what I was supposed to be
Right.
doing. And they'd given you like a bow that was obviously a slow firing weapon that you would not want to like go toe to toe with a guard with, um, rather than the crossbow that felt a little bit more rapid fire.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and yeah, so it's about teaching the player how to play it, and making it so that the the challenges that are presented to the player are the ones that you intend there to be. So in continuing to use Thief as an example, that's a game about stealth. So it's all about basically choosing a route, biding your time, waiting until the coast is clear, moving from shadow to shadow. It's about kind of exploring the space, and like using cautious, and it promotes quite a slow pace of play. Um, and if the guards spot you, then it tends to promote you just like getting the hell out of there until everything's calmed down a bit. Um, Whereas something like Doom Eternal is fully designed for you to just hurl yourself into combat as with wild abandon and keep on moving. And so all of the game mechanics are designed around um, just constantly sort of like attack, 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 um, and not being cautious. It's like the polar opposite of Thief. So you've got to teach the player how you expect them to play the game.
Yeah.
Otherwise, if somebody tries to play Thief like they would play Doom Eternal, or like I played it, then they will suck at it and won't enjoy themselves. Similarly, if I try to play Doom Eternal the way I play Thief, I'm not going to have fun. Um,
A
because
good tutorial is like um I think it can be quite challenging to make a good tutorial. There are some games that make it like that do it really well, and you kind of almost don't even really realize that you're in a tutorial at all. I remember my first game, which is not an example of that at all. We literally had just by the way that we made it, it was a mobile game, and there were lots of things that we were up against in order to have a tutorial in the first place. That we ended up it being a separate button, so you could either dive in and just be like, I'll figure it out as I go, which I wouldn't recommend ever for the game that we made. But then, like having the tutorial, it was literally like you have to follow through. Like so, until you've pressed the correct button, you can't progress to do the next thing,
yeah,
which always feels a bit like, yeah, okay, cool. And we did try and make it like super quick, so that even you press it, it does a thing. Okay, what's the next thing? Press it, do the next thing. Almost like to be able to allow you to skip through, but still know that this is what you had to press to do it. Um, yeah, being able to allow the player to learn how to play your game and not turn them off.
yeah.
That in itself is a task.
It really is, because I mean the classic example is like Mega Man, which does a great example of it like teases you with like the Mega Man's full powers, and then sort of like takes them all away from you and sets you back a bit, and then slowly reintroduces them one at a time, and lets you get used to each one as you go. Lots of games do it that way, and it's a really natural way to tutorialize it, which is how you end up with the Assassin's Creed games, because there's so much in them. They're still introducing new features and abilities to you 10 hours into the game.
Yeah,
Um, and you're still learning stuff, but you have to do it that way, because you literally could not pick up everything that was in Assassin's Creed
no
in
way.
a
Yeah,
1 minute tutorial.
no.
I mean, I've had that. One of the early Splinter Cell games had a tutorial which was basically kind of like, right, here's the here's how to, you had an obstacle course. You had to use every ability in the game to get through this obstacle course, and it taught you all of this stuff, but it did it all in a very compressed space and said sort of like, right, you've got through the obstacle course, now you know what all of your abilities are, off you go.
Yeah,
And it was like, oh, well, I can't remember them, because I've done each one precisely once to get through the
Yeah,
obstacle course and
yeah.
then forgotten. You need to let people play and enjoy themselves and get used to the feel of it before you move on. Um,
I think
just
Mario has always been another one of the ones that's like a pinnacle because
yeah.
within that first level, you're taught um, almost everything really, like that you have
Hmm.
to jump there. There are gaps you need to traverse. Then you get past the traversing the gaps and the steps, and then it's like, oh, here's an enemy. Jump on the enemy. Ah, okay, that's how you kill an enemy. Here's a thing like, and by the time you get to the end of that first to the first flag, you've almost learned everything that you need to learn about the game.
It's a great example actually, because like it's interesting that like Nintendo's two biggest games, Mario and Zelda, are very diametrically opposed in that sense, where Zelda is all about um, uh, kind of like unlocking like a host of different tools to so a whole bunch of
Yeah.
different lock and key mechanics that allow you to explore different parts of the game, and they're all cool. Whereas Mario is much more about sort of like, what can you do with these simple core abilities?
Yeah.
And that, so Mario is much more about sort of developing mastery, where Zelda is much more about following along with the story, unlocking sort of like tools for completionists, so on and so forth. And just to come back to accessibility, I see accessibility support as just an extension of usability. It's
Mm.
uh, you know, um, good example is with 8-bit games that I grew up on. Um, they tended, because like some games would like use a joystick if they were simple. More complicated games would just basically like just use like every key on the keyboard for different things. So you would have um, you'd be playing a tactical game or something like that, and you just have, for different like moves for a unit, you would just like have different buttons that would make them like rest or like resupply
Yeah.
or go on Overwatch. And so there was some quite complex game ideas in a lot of the 8-bit games that were really really hard to get your head around, because like in those days, like the tutorialization tended to be reading the manual while it loaded. um
Yeah.
so
Good pastimes.
yeah,
Yeah.
happy days. uh but the thing
and
is,
and making like grabbing a bit of paper and writing down a cheat sheet essentially that you kept on
yeah,
hand.
you'd have like those like magazines would come with like a keyboard like thing that you would
Mm,
fit over your keyboard, and it
yeah,
had labels for a particular game and so on,
yeah.
which helped a little bit, but then you'd still end up looking at the keyboard layout to remember what button was what.
Yeah. You're like, isn't it? I'm
Yeah.
sure that. Oh no, I'm dead. Okay, good.
Whereas
Fine.
nowadays we've got a whole host of like user interface things, like for strategy games, for example. You know, you can have like right click context menus that present you all of the available options and tooltips that explain what things mean and stuff like that. There's a lot of like stuff that could have been done on those 8-bit games. There's no reason that you couldn't have like an 8-bit game with like tooltips on it, or pop-up menus like the Final Fantasy, like the early
Yeah.
Final Fantasy games, that allowed you to select things rather than just press a key to get things. But this was when games were in their infancy, and like the
Yeah, I was
easiest
gonna
way
say
to.
we do need to be kind to the retro games.
Yeah, no,
They definitely hadn't figured out everything that we've figured out now. And I imagine in probably in like 10 years' time, people will be looking back at the games that we made and they're like, can you believe they had it like so clunky?
I don't know. I think that's a discussion in itself, actually, because I
Yeah.
think that we have got to the point now that we have like fully 3D games, and like we've refined, we're getting to the point of diminishing returns, where it's
Yeah.
getting really really hard to innovate in significant ways, and the sort of innovation that we're seeing is much more subtle innovation. Like, for example, the difference, but I say subtle, the difference between Thief and Doom Eternal. They're
Mm.
both first person games about exploration and a bit of shooting, but one of them is focused on sort of like taking it slow and like using the environment, and the other one is focused on sort of like using the enemies as your tools. So
Yeah.
that um, that's a I'm calling that a subtle distinction, even though it's really not that subtle. But
Yeah.
it's the sort of thing that I think that we're starting to see differences. There's a lot of games that are basically like third-person action games,
Mm.
but you see a lot of variety within that. So you might have um, something like The Witcher 3 and Grand Theft Auto and Dynasty Warriors all look more or less the same in terms of like you've got a figure on screen,
Yeah.
um, but they play entirely differently, all of them, because they are designed to present a slightly different player experience.
Yeah.
And I think that that's where we're starting to see more innovation now, because we have solved a lot of the more basic problems of giving the player a lot of options. I mean, we have made a controller that bristles with buttons that is kind of intimidating for people who are not used to it,
Mm.
but it works.
Yeah.
And a lot of not many games use all of those buttons. In fairness,
That's true. Yeah. A lot of games you just there are your core buttons that you'll use, your bread and butter buttons for
yeah,
the game, and then you just kind of need to have in your periphery um, what those other buttons do if and when you need them.
yeah,
So because you mentioned Doom there, I think
yeah,
we've got a nice little segue into aesthetics and atmosphere with audio.
yeah.
It's like early Doom. Obviously, was aesthetically. Well, at the time,
Oh,
everyone was just like, "Oh my god, this looks amazing."
it
To us
was.
now, we're like, "Oh my god, there's so much like flat imagery there." But atmosphere wise was very heavy. Audio
Yeah,
wise was like it just had like a really full package. And I think they even today that they've come along with that is updated and upgraded in such a beautiful way.
yeah, yeah.
What are your thoughts on aesthetics and atmosphere?
I mean, I think it's probably the most obvious contributor to the player experience.
Yeah,
You can provide the exact same environment to explore, and it will feel completely different if in a survival horror game to a like World War II shooter. Um, even to the extent where like you've got some games like a game like Half-Life 2, where they suddenly sort of like take you to what's the town called, the like Ravenwood, something like that. There's um there's basically halfway through Half-Life 2, there's that town which is full of like headcrab zombies, and it's basically it turns for one level it all goes survival horror,
yeah,
um, and that that's all about the I mean, there's game design elements to that as well, but there's a lot of build up to Ravenholm, I think is the name of the town. There's a lot of build up to that level to start to get you sort of like nervous about it. Um, and then the look of it is it's a much more gothic looking level, where the rest of the game is a bit more um, like brutalist or natural landscapes.
yeah.
Um, and yeah, so I mean, obviously, it is the graphics and the audio that can make a game feel scary or pleasant, and so on. But
Yeah, I think Dark Souls is one of my recent good examples as well. Like, especially with the fact that every boss, and I didn't realize this on the onset. Actually learned about it later on from when you start to digest. Like, well, why is
mm,
that so good? And it turned out that the movement of each boss follows through with the pacing of the music. And so I think there's one I can't remember what she's called, but she's like this massive, haunting, ghostly female boss,
hmm
and the music has a really unusual pattern to it, but she plays to that exact pattern. And like,
That's a really nice feature.
I know, isn't that just
That's I was not aware of that. That's
yeah,
the first time I'm
honestly,
hearing.
do yourself a favor and find a YouTube video on it. I think that there's a particularly, I can't remember which guy it is. Maybe I'll try and find it and send it to you. But like, yeah, the fact that and again, that that adds to the atmosphere, because you don't even you it's not something that you are openly aware of as you're playing.
Mm,
um but it's such a massive impact when the music is like hitting a beat or something and the character is hitting you with that beat. I just getting a little bit
yeah.
goosebumpy thinking about it.
Yeah.
Some game designers have just thought to that next level on how can I deliver a feeling to a player,
Yeah.
and what is the what is the thing that can do that.
Yeah. That's a really good example, actually,
Mm.
of a less obvious way in which that aesthetics and atmosphere contribute.
It's
Um,
so sneaky but so powerful.
yeah, but I mean, even within just the aesthetics, um,
Mm.
there's that is a tiny, tiny little feedback loop. So the fact that, for example, like you walk through a doorway and you walk into a room that is darker, um, and the the sounds change because like it's a big room but it's dark, and so like you walk
Mm.
in there and like your footsteps are now echoing, and and you can't see as far, and so all of those things totally change the experience, just because you've like stepped through a doorway, and it's amazing what there was. Best example I can think of for this was I played a fan made total conversion for Doom, to make it into
Right.
Aliens. Sorry.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, Doom borrows heavily from Aliens anyway, but
Yeah.
somebody had taken the trouble to sort of like do a complete conversion. It went through the whole movie and so on. Some of the clever things that they did in that was like the first level had no aliens in it at all it had were sort of like quotes from the movie that would triggered at certain points, which would startle you. And so you played through the entire first level expecting there to be aliens, and there
Right.
weren't. And you didn't know until you finished the level, and it says sort of like kills 0 out of 0. It's like, oh, you absolute bitch. Um, but it was
Yeah.
great, and because it felt really tense, and you still felt sort of, I found the armory. Look, there's 8 shotgun shells. Yes. Um, and then halfway through the second level, you're exploring the base, and everything's like nerve-wracking and so on, because you know that like the aliens are scary. And then you go down a lift and you get to the bottom of the lift, and it's all sort of like alien goo. And
Right.
literally with the Doom engine, because it's got very sort of like rectangular walls and stuff, they just filled the alien goo space with stalagmites and stalactites of like black goo, so that you couldn't even see the shape of the room that you were in. Um, and like, I just took one look at that and went, I am not going there until I absolutely have to.
Yeah.
Uh, and that it just created that like very obvious kind of like, this is a bad place to go into. Um, and that was a great experience.
I think we are almost like quite spoilt these days with what we can do aesthetically.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm definitely more aware that I feel like we're getting bigger changes in audio and how we play with audio right now than aesthetics, because we've now got everything from low poly to hyper realistic, um, and cinema and film and cinema has largely done everything that we take from in order to like visually set up certain a feeling visually. Um, so it'd be interesting to see like where what is left to push in that area. So let's move on to our last.
I have one last
Oh
note
yeah,
on
go on, go on.
aesthetics and atmosphere. Something
Yeah.
that video games can do that cinema can't, because you raised that.
Mm,
Um, is, for example, being able to design your own character and
right.
choose how you are represented in the game
Yeah.
is some that is unique to video games. Um, and that is a very powerful thing for the player experience, to be able to make an avatar that looks like you, that is your gender or your skin color, or whatever, um, and that is a significant, um, has a significant effect on the player's experience, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely something that's very powerful, because even if you don't, because I find kind of in most cases these days, I don't particularly create a character that looks like me, but I do create a character that I want to have created,
Yeah.
or that, like, an idea that I've had, and that gives you just as much buy-in on this, like, you care about this character. You've almost, like, you and I both have kids, so we know what it's like to create something and be like, I really care about this thing I created. And yeah,
Yeah,
I think that's really powerful in games.
I
So
think, yeah. I mean, kids are obviously the ultimate expression of that, but
yeah.
everybody loves to like design their own avatar, and it makes you a little bit more invested in that character if you have put some effort into choosing the way that they look, even if they look nothing like you.
So from that element of fun
Yeah.
into fun. Um, uh, Fun is such, because it's like most people have a slightly different idea of fun. Obviously, there are some, some massive generalizations you can make, in terms of what is fun and what isn't fun.
Mhm.
We've got a pretty good idea of what we think is fun, but I think quite often, we especially when we're designing games, we come up with a thing and we're like, this is going to be so much fun to play, and then we give it to someone and they either go, oh, I don't get it, or they're like, yeah, it was okay, and you're like, no, no, that was like the most fun you could have, and they're like, yeah, no, it was all right. How do you try and measure fun?
Oh crumbs!
Mm.
That's such a hard one.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, I mean, it's very subjective. It's very woolly. Um, as a game designer, at the end of the day, you basically have to sort of like making best guesses about what is going to work well together.
Yeah.
Um, but very often you have to implement it to see how it feels, because you can accidentally create, put multiple sort of like mechanics and aesthetics together in such a way that you've created something that has an unintended effect. Um,
Yeah.
so, I mean, a classic example of that is the Grand Theft Auto thing, where um, you can mug people and get some money off them, because it's a game about being a criminal, and
Yeah.
you can also sleep with hookers to regain health. Um, and then when you put those two mechanics together and you sleep with a hooker to regain your health and then mug them to take your money back, that's like a really, really unpleasant
Yeah.
thing to have put in the game. And obviously, and the tabloids jumped on that with the assumption that if it was possible, it was intentional.
Yeah.
Um, and I suspect that at worst, like somebody at Rockstar like recognized that you could do that and thought sort of like, yikes! But it's a game about chaos
Yeah.
and being the bad guy. So sure, let it stand. And maybe regretted it later.
I
But
would imagine so. Yeah.
Yeah, but that's a good example of an unintended consequence of game mechanics working together in weird ways, and that which is a great example of why you just have to iterate. You have to put stuff in, try it out, see if it works. You have to give it to other people who like which is basically what focus testing is like giving it to
Yeah.
people who are not you
Yeah.
to have a go and see what see what they make of it. Whether you know, do they understand the way that it all fits together? Do they discover an exploit in the way that it all fits together, and so on? And does the way that it fits together work for them? Because in some cases, like as a designer, you can design something that like works really well for you and maybe a small niche of people, but maybe the majority of people don't get the same enjoyment out of that particular thing. So you've got to. I mean, it's really hard to measure. I think like the easiest thing is just to watch other people playing it and what they see what they do.
Yeah.
And that I think is that's why going to shows is really useful. Actually, just watching over somebody's shoulder, watching them play the game, and trying to resist the urge to tell them how to do it,
Mm.
um,
Yeah.
and watching them struggle, and
Yeah.
watching
You
them
just
sort
you
of
just
like,
kind of have to like you have to measure the emotion. You literally because you
yeah,
there might be a temptation to be like, oh well, let's measure the giggle. Let's see how much they giggle while playing, or
I
they're
mean,
clearly they're having a good time. But also you want those moments where they're like, oh damn,
yeah,
oh,
yeah,
or like, oh whoa. You need to literally measure as much different type of emotion as you can get. Hopefully you do get quite a lot out of them,
yeah,
in terms of like the levels and stuff. But because a good game, as we mentioned previously, does it takes you on a peaks and troughs like roller coaster ride. You don't want it to be like flat out extreme, because that, well, a, that's exhausting, but b, it's not very compelling. And
yeah,
you don't feel the highs if you don't have the lows.
yeah. I mean, I will say, I mean, this almost is a good way to wrap it up. But the best focus tests are the ones where they will video the game being played, and they will also video the player playing it.
Yeah.
Which I think is why sort of like watching streamers is so useful to
Mm.
game
Yeah.
developers, because effectively they are basically voluntarily focus testing your game. So if you can get a game out into early access and get streamers to play it, that's really useful, because watching their face as they try to learn your game and play through your game is the best indicator that you have of the player experience that is going on inside their head. Um,
I would say yes to that, definitely, but I think also, um, you just need to like be aware of the caveat that they are playing to an audience,
for
and that
streamers,
yeah,
that's true.
yeah.
For for focus testing, if it's just sort of like people who have signed up to just to play a game,
Mm,
and they know they're being recorded, but they don't expect like
yeah,
millions of people on the internet. You're right. The
yeah.
streamers are doing it to entertain, so they will um,
Oh, but I mean, even with that,
filter it a bit.
like they s- a streamer can still give you like a good indication of
Yeah.
where you can look for those emotions, because if they're like, whoa, that came out of nowhere, you can actually look into it and be like, did that come out of nowhere? Is that as good as that seems? Or yeah, the because they, I mean, they do tend to play up anything that they deem as surprising, don't they? Like, whoa, I can't believe how powerful this gun is, and you're like, come on, man.
Exactly. Well, exactly. They. I mean, in some ways, it just highlights stuff that any other player would feel, because
Mm,
at the end of the day, they are having a player experience in their head, and then they are exaggerating that player experience for entertainment value.
yeah,
Um,
it's possible that might be actually like more useful, but
in some ways, yeah,
yeah,
because they will latch on if something if they like something, then they will latch onto that and say so and
exploit it.
express how
Yeah,
much they like it. If they can pet the dog, then they're
yeah,
they're going to go sort of like, oh my god, I can pet the dog. This is so cute, and so on.
yeah.
Or if something startles them, then they're going to scream like a baby. Um,
Like PewDiePie and any
yeah,
horror game that you
exactly.
ever.
So, obviously, you've got to bear in mind, but it is fascinating that what I think is interesting as well, actually, is that with the growth of people who enjoy just watching streamers play games,
Mm,
we are seeing that watching someone else's player experience is as entertaining as having that experience for yourself.
yeah.
And I think that that's really interesting, because I have quite enjoyed watching some streamers, particularly streamers who are friends of mine, streaming Elden Ring, that I don't think
Yeah.
I'm ever going to be able to play, even though it's not as tough as Dark Souls by all accounts.
Mm,
I love. the aesthetics,
Yeah.
the atmosphere, the narrative, um, all of that stuff, fascinating. But it's just that sort of like challenge aspect of the game design that I'm totally not into and can't play. But it's really rewarding watching someone who is into the challenge keep plugging away at the same boss until they damn well beat it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Okay, cool. So that's going to be it from us for today. Thank you, Chris, for joining me and co-hosting on this very interesting episode for all of you listeners out there. Obviously, you can find us every Monday. We drop an episode every Monday. You can find out more about us at gamedev.london. In fact, yeah, everything's there. Or you can join our Discord community, gamedev.london/join. We're on all the socials, just Game Dev London. We're fairly easy to find at this point. You could probably Google us. In fact, I know that you can Google us and you'll find every link you need. Chris, where can people find you and more about you?
I'm on Twitter as Quixotl, Quixotl, and you can probably find links from there.
Cool. In that case, that all that remains is to say thanks for joining us and see you again next time.
See ya.